Before the sky fell, my world was one of whispers. I was Dr. Eris Thorne, and my work was listening to the dead, not in a spiritual sense, but a cosmic one. As the lead xenolinguist at the Kepler Institute in San Francisco, I spent my days sifting through the faint, fossilized radio signals of long-dead civilizations, searching for patterns, for the ghost of a syntax in the cosmic static. We'd never found a living voice, not once, but the echoes were there, scattered across the void like bone fragments. They told stories of civilizations that rose and fell in silence, their triumphs and tragedies encoded in the mathematical purity of their transmissions, dead for 1,000,000 years before their light even reached our probes. I believed in this cosmic graveyard. I believed that understanding their endings would teach us how to navigate our beginning, our first steps into that vast, silent night. I argued for peace, for caution. I wrote papers titled The Great Filter as a failure to communicate and lectured on the hubris of assuming a hostile universe. I was a fool, a romantic staring at the stars while a tidal wave gathered in the dark. The wave had a name, the Architects. That's what we called them later. We never learned what they called themselves. It happened on a Tuesday. I was on a conference call with the European Space Agency, debating the potential grammatical structure of a signal fragment from the Cygnus X1 region when the first tremor hit. It wasn't seismic. It was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in your bones, a sound that felt older than mountains. My coffee mug danced across my desk, and the holographic displays flickered, the ancient alien symbols dissolving into pixelated noise. Then came the light. Through the panoramic window of my office, which overlooked the Golden Gate Bridge, I saw the sky ignite. It wasn't a flash or an explosion. It was a tearing. The blue canvas of the afternoon was ripped open, and through the gash poured a color we had no name for, a searing, liquid gold that was both beautiful and utterly terrifying. People in the streets stopped, their faces turned upward in awe, not yet understanding that they were looking at their own executioner from the tier in reality. A single needle-thin shard of what I could only describe as solidified darkness descended. It didn't fall. It was placed, inserted into the heart of the city with a surgeon's precision. There was no sound, not at first, just a pressure wave that shattered every window in the institute and threw me from my chair. I remember the air turning hot and thick, tasting of ozone and burnt metal. When I dragged myself back to the window, gasping, the city was gone. Where downtown San Francisco had been, there was now only a perfectly circular, mile-wide crater, its edges cauterized into gleaming black glass. The bay was boiling, sending plumes of steam into the sky that mixed with the golden, alien light. The Golden Gate Bridge, our proud symbol of resilience, sagged in the middle, its steel bones melting like wax. The shard was gone, having delivered its message. The message was simple: you do not matter. The awe in the streets had turned to screams, then to silence. That's when I understood the true nature of the Great Filter. It wasn't a test you failed. It was a predator you didn't see until its jaws were closing around you. The first strike was global, coordinated, and utterly merciless. London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Lagos all gone in the same instant. Not conquered, but erased. The architects didn't use bombs or missiles. That would have been too primitive, too inefficient. They used something we later came to call gravity lances. Weapons that didn't just destroy matter, but unmade it, leaving behind nothing but those glassy, black wounds on the face of the earth. My husband, Ben, was at a symposium in London. My daughter, Chloe, was on a school trip in Tokyo. I learned of their deaths not from a person, but from a red dot on a global threat map that blinked once and then went dark. There was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. They were simply deleted from existence, their atoms scattered into the fundamental forces that govern the universe. In that moment, the scholar in me died, and something else, something cold and hard, began to take root in the hollow space where my heart had been. In the chaos that followed, the remnants of the world's governments formed a unified command. Borders became meaningless lines on an obsolete map. You were either human or you were the enemy. I was evacuated from the ruins of the Institute by a Marine fire team. My datapads clutched to my chest like a holy text. They took me to Cheyenne Mountain, the Cold War relic reactivated as humanity's last bastion. Down in the granite heart of the mountain, surrounded by grim-faced generals and weeping politicians. I was no longer a theorist. I was a weapon. They didn't want to know about the dead civilizations I had studied. They wanted to know about the one that was actively trying to kill us. General Marcus Thorne, no relation. A cruel irony that bound me to the military machine, looked at me with eyes that had seen too much death. "Doctor," he said, his voice like gravel. "You understand alien languages. Their ships are in orbit, broadcasting. Tell us what they're saying. Tell us how to kill them." The architect's language wasn't sound or symbol. It was a complex, multi-layered transmission of quantum-entangled particles, a language woven into the fabric of space-time itself. It was elegant, profound, and utterly without emotion. It took me 3 weeks, working in a caffeine-fueled haze of grief and rage, to crack the primary layer. The generals expected a declaration of war, a list of demands, a reason for the slaughter. They got none of that. The broadcast, the one playing on a continuous loop as their ships silently orbited our broken world, was not for us. It was a surveyor's report, a resource assessment. I stood before the unified command, my hands shaking, and translated the first coherent message from our destroyers. Subject species carbon-based, pre-interstellar, type 0.7 civilization, high emotional volatility, minimal strategic threat, primary planetary resources, water, heavy metals, nitrogen, verdict planet designated for resource reclamation, indigenous population to be sterilized, process initiated. The room was silent. Sterilized. That was the word they used. We weren't being conquered, we were being cleansed, like bacteria from a petri dish before a new experiment could begin. We were an inconvenience, a footnote in a resource ledger. All our history, our art, our love, our hate, it was all just mold to be scraped away. General Thorne looked at the translation on the main screen, his jaw tight. "Reclamation," he whispered, the word tasting like poison. He then turned to me, and his eyes weren't asking for a way to communicate anymore. They were asking for a way to hurt. "You understand how they talk?" "Doctor," he said, the steel returning to his voice. "Now, find me a way to make them scream." That was the moment my transformation was complete. The hope for understanding was replaced by a singular, burning need for retribution. I didn't want to talk to the architects. I wanted to dissect their language, find its pressure points, its vulnerabilities, and turn their own elegant words into a weapon that would tear them apart from the inside out. I buried Eris the academic and became Eris the architect of vengeance. My lab became my sanctuary and my forge. While the remnants of our armies fought and died in desperate, hopeless battles against their automated ground drones, I worked. I repurposed our deep space arrays, not to listen, but to broadcast. The architect language was quantum-based, which meant it was intrinsically linked to their technology, their ships, their very biology. It wasn't just how they spoke, it was how they operated. Their ships were semi-sentient. Their drones networked through this quantum data stream. If I could introduce a virus, a mimetic weapon that used their own language as a vector, I could turn their greatest strength into their most catastrophic weakness. I called it Project Chimera. The concept was brutal. I wouldn't just send a shutdown code. I would send a signal that mimicked their own biosignatures, but with a corrupted payload. A signal that didn't just sever their network, but that induced a feedback loop, forcing their own systems to overload. I designed it to be agonizing, the linguistic equivalent of a prion disease, folding their perfect language in on itself until it became a cascade of pure, meaningless noise. The first test was on a captured architect drone, a sleek, insectoid machine that had been disabled in the fighting outside Denver. We had it contained in a shielded hangar, its single red optic scanning the room with cold indifference. I sat at a terminal, my fingers poised over the keyboard. General Thorne stood behind me, his breath held. "Send it," he ordered. I initiated the broadcast. For a moment, nothing happened. The drone remained still. Then, its limbs began to twitch. The smooth, dark carapace of its armor began to fracture, hairline cracks appearing as a low hum emanated from its core. The hum rose in pitch, becoming a high-frequency shriek that vibrated through the floor. The red optic flickered wildly, and then the drone began to tear itself apart. Its articulated limbs snapped backward, its power core ruptured, and it collapsed into a heap of twitching, ruined machinery, still emitting that tortured, electronic scream. We had not just killed it. We had given it a nervous system, and then we had used it to make it feel pain. A young technician in the corner of the room threw up. General Thorne put a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, approving. "Good," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion but grim satisfaction. "Now, scale it up. I want to broadcast this sound from every satellite, every radio tower, every transmitter we have left. I want their ships in orbit to hear this song. I want them to know the mold is fighting back." As I looked at the broken machine on the hangar floor, I felt no remorse, no horror at what I had done. I only felt a cold, quiet certainty. I thought of Ben's laugh and Chloe's hand in mine. I thought of the glass crater where my home used to be. The architects had written us off as a footnote in their cosmic ledger. They were about to learn that footnotes can bleed, and that when you cut a human, they don't just bleed ink. They bleed fire, and they burn down the whole damn library. The war for survival was over. The war for revenge had just begun. And I, Dr. Eris Thorne, had just composed its opening symphony. The 2 weeks it took to orchestrate the global broadcast of Project Chimera were the longest of my life. Cheyenne Mountain became the central nervous system of a dying world, and I was the neuron firing the single, lethal command. We became scavengers of our own technology, routing power from blacked-out cities, cannibalizing satellite networks, and jury-rigging a planetary broadcast system from the bones of a civilization the architects had already pronounced dead. Engineers, their faces smudged with grease and sleeplessness, worked in hushed reverence around me. They called me the ghost singer, the woman who had learned to speak the enemy's language. They didn't understand that I wasn't speaking. I was screaming, and I was using the entire planet as my larynx. General Thorne was my shadow, a constant, grim presence ensuring that every resource, every last man, was dedicated to my symphony of pain. He never asked about the ethics, about the nature of the weapon I had created. He only asked, "Is it ready?" On the 14th day, standing in the cold, blue light of the Central Command Amphitheater, the pit, I finally answered him, "It is." The final sequence was initiated not with a dramatic button press, but with a quiet voice command into my terminal. Execute Chimera. The word felt small, inadequate for the cataclysm it was about to unleash. For a few seconds, the only change was a spike on a global energy output graph and the low hum of the mountain's core systems deepening into a resonant growl. We were gathering every spare watt of power left to humanity and focusing it into a single, planet-wide scream. I watched the main holographic display, which showed Earth hanging in the void, surrounded by a delicate, spiderweb lattice of red icons, the Architect orbital fleet. They hung there as they always did, silent, patient, like vultures waiting for the corpse to stop twitching. Then, my signal, my corrupted linguistic plague, hit them. It was a wave of pure information, a weaponized sentence that said only one thing in their perfect quantum language: die in agony. The effect was instantaneous and silent. On the screen, the red icons began to flicker. One by one, they turned a brilliant, catastrophic white from the real-time feeds coming in from the few remaining orbital telescopes. We saw it happen. The Architect ships, those sleek, obsidian needles that had seemed so invincible, began to convulse. It wasn't an explosion. It was a seizure. Lights strobed erratically along their hulls, and their forms, once so precise, began to warp and distort as if the geometry of space itself was rejecting them. Their quantum network had become a self-consuming Ouroboros of agony. The surveyor's report had turned into a feedback loop of digital shrieking, and their semi-sentient ships were tearing themselves apart to make it stop. Pylons buckled, hulls cracked, and from those cracks bled not fire, but the raw, unnamed golden energy of their drive cores. The silence was the most terrifying part. A fleet was dying above our heads, and it was making no sound. Then they began to fall. They weren't just falling. They were being dragged from the sky, pulled down by the same gravity they had weaponized against us. The heavens opened up, and it began to rain gods. Across the planet, from every continent, survivors looked up to see the stars themselves streaking toward the earth. Fiery trails of gold and white crisscrossed the twilight sky. A meteor shower of our own making. For the first time in months, the world was filled with light. The beautiful, terrible light of our vengeance. In the pit, a sound I hadn't heard since the world ended began to ripple through the room, a cheer. It started as a choked sob from a young lieutenant and swelled into a raw, primal roar of triumph from 100 throats. Men and women wept, embraced, and pounded on consoles. We had done it. We had struck back. We had hurt them. General Thorne stood beside me, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the screen where the last of the red icons winked out. He didn't cheer. He just nodded slowly, a grim stonemason seeing his work completed. Good, he rumbled. That's a start. I felt nothing. The cheers, the tears, the back-slapping relief. It all felt like it was happening behind a thick wall of glass. I had orchestrated the single most successful counterattack in human history, and all I could feel was a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. I saw the falling ships not as victory, but as a funeral pyre for my family, for my entire world. This act of monumental violence hadn't brought Ben or Chloe back. It hadn't rebuilt San Francisco. It had only deepened the wound, cauterized it with hate. I had become a creator of ghosts, a conductor for a requiem of falling fire. That night, I excused myself from the celebrations and found a secluded monitoring station, pulling up the recordings of the Chimera broadcast. I listened to the signal I had created, not as a weapon, but as a linguist. I analyzed the cascading failure of their language, the death of their syntax, and in the heart of the agonizing noise, I found something I hadn't expected, a response. It was faint, a single, coherent packet of data that had been broadcast from the lead architect vessel in the final second before it tore itself apart. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't a surrender. It was a single, cold, analytical statement. Threat reassessment required. Local species exhibits unexpected mimetic warfare capabilities. Deployment of Exorcist-class assets authorized. My blood ran cold. Exorcist-class assets. The name itself was a threat. We hadn't won. We had just passed a test we didn't know we were taking. The drones. The orbital fleet. They were just the surveyors. The exterminators sent to deal with vermin. We had proven we weren't just vermin. We were a complex infestation, a sentient plague. So they were sending in the specialists. I took my findings to Thorne. The celebrations in the mountain had died down, replaced by the sober, grinding work of assessing the damage and planning the future. He listened to my translation in his Spartan office, his face an unreadable mask of granite. When I finished, he steepled his fingers and stared at the wall for a full minute. So, he said, his voice quiet, "The scout ants are dead, and now the soldiers are coming." He wasn't afraid. If anything, he seemed grimly satisfied, as if this was the war he had been expecting all along. "This changes nothing, Doctor," he told me, his eyes locking onto mine. "It just means your work isn't done. They sent us a new word. I want you to find a way to make them choke on it." The weeks that followed were a strange, tense honeymoon for the human race. With the orbital threat gone, humanity began to crawl out of its bunkers and hiding places. A fragile network of communication was reestablished between survivor enclaves. For the first time, we had a real inventory of our losses, nearly 6 billion dead. But we also had a victory. The story of the ghost singer and the fallen sky became a myth, a legend whispered over crackling radios, a spark of hope in the endless dark. I was humanity's savior, its avenging angel. But in the labs deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, I felt more like a Cassandra, desperately trying to warn of a doom that only I could see coming. I pored over the intercepted message, dissecting every quantum fluctuation. The linguistic structure was different from the surveyor's broadcast. It was denser, more complex, and it had an undercurrent of something that had been absent before intent. The first attack had been impersonal. This felt focused. The first exorcist arrived without warning a month later. It didn't tear a hole in the sky. It simply appeared, coalescing out of the thin air above the ruins of what was once Chicago. Our new early warning systems, designed to detect their FTL signatures, saw nothing. It was just there. It wasn't a ship. It was a being, a colossal biomechanical entity that defied terrestrial physics. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but it stood over 1,000 feet tall, its body a shifting lattice of black, chitinous plates and veins of that same sickening golden light. It had no face, only a smooth, obsidian surface that seemed to drink the light from the sky. It stood motionless in the center of a radiation-scarred crater for a full day, an obsidian statue judging a ruined world. We threw everything we had at it. A squadron of reactivated F-35s launched a volley of our most powerful conventional missiles. The missiles flew true, and then, 100 yards from the entity, they simply ceased to exist. Unmade by a localized gravity field, General Thorne ordered a strike from one of our new orbital railgun platforms. A desperate weapon rushed into service. A tungsten rod the size of a telephone pole, fired from orbit at a fraction of the speed of light, impacted the creature's location. The resulting explosion should have dug a new Great Lake. When the dust settled, the exorcist stood in the center of the fresh crater, untouched. A single, hairline crack marred its featureless face, the first and only damage we ever managed to inflict. Then, it moved. It didn't walk. It simply raised one enormous hand, and the ground for miles around it began to liquefy. Buildings that had survived the initial apocalypse crumbled into dust. The very bedrock of the continent groaned in protest. It wasn't destroying. It was reformatting. It was methodically, patiently, turning a piece of earth back into primordial, sterile matter. And it was broadcasting, not the cold, analytical language of the surveyors, but something new. A focused, high-energy quantum signal directed at a single location, Cheyenne Mountain. My lab system shrieked alarms. It was talking to me. I was a linguist, and this new entity was speaking a language I finally understood. It wasn't a report. It was a challenge, a taunt. I translated the single, repeating phrase for the terrified command staff in the pit. "You who sing the song of noise," it said, the words appearing on the screen, feeling less like a translation and more like an accusation. "We have come to bring you silence." The exorcist in Chicago was just the first. The message was a declaration. The exterminators were gone. The true architects had arrived. And they hadn't just come to reclaim the planet. They had come to personally tear out the tongue of the ghost who had dared to sing back. The message from the exorcist echoed not in the air of Cheyenne Mountain, but in the minds of everyone in the pit. "We have come to bring you silence." It was a death sentence delivered with the cold precision of a god. The brief, fragile hope that had blossomed after the fall of the fleet withered in an instant, replaced by a dread so profound it was a physical weight. Generals who had faced down nuclear annihilation during the Cold War stared at the holographic image of the obsidian giant in Chicago, their faces pale and slack. They were soldiers, and the thing they were facing was not a problem that could be solved with a bullet. It was a concept, a walking, patient apocalypse, and it had called out their only effective weapon by name. All eyes in the room turned to me. I was no longer the ghost singer, the avenging angel. I was the target. the one human the architects deemed worthy of a personal visit. General Thorne moved to my side, his presence a shield of granite against the rising tide of fear in the room. He ignored the panicked whispers of his subordinates and spoke to me in a low, steady voice, his words for my ears alone. "Doctor, it's talking to you. What do you have to say back?" His question cut through my own shock. He wasn't asking if I could fight it. He was assuming I would. In his simple, brutal calculus, a conversation was just another form of combat, a dialogue with the abyss. I looked at the entity on the screen, at the way it methodically unmade our world, and I understood. The chimera signal had been a scream of pure, undiluted pain. It had worked on the networked fleet, a system designed for data, because it was the equivalent of a denial-of-service attack on their collective soul. But this exorcist was different. It was singular. It was broadcasting a focused, coherent thought. Screaming at it would be like throwing a rock at a mountain. It had initiated a dialogue, and to fight it, I had to engage it on that level. I had to craft a new weapon, not of noise, but of logic. A poison pill wrapped in perfect syntax. "I'm going to need more power. General," I said, my voice finding a cold, steady register I didn't know it possessed. "And I'm going to need complete autonomy. Every antenna, every array we have left, slave to my console. No questions, no oversight." Thorne didn't hesitate. He turned to the stunned command staff. "You heard the doctor," he barked, his voice once again the sound of absolute authority. "Give her the world. Everyone else, find a way to slow that thing down." He knew they couldn't, but a soldier needs his orders, even if they are impossible. For him, the true battlefield had just shrunk to the size of my laboratory. The new endeavor had no official project name. In the quiet of my own mind, I called it Orpheus. I wasn't screaming into the void anymore. I was descending into the underworld with a new song, not to retrieve a lost love, but to poison its king. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of communion with the enemy. I let its broadcast wash over me, a constant, crushing stream of its alien consciousness. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a philosophy, a declaration of purpose. In the quantum stream of its language, I felt its immense age, its unshakable certainty. It saw the universe not in terms of life and death, but of order and noise, and humanity. With our chaotic emotions, our illogical art, our messy, beautiful, violent existence was the ultimate source of noise. We were a flaw in the code of creation, a discordant note in the symphony of the spheres. The chimera signal had been so offensive to it not because it caused pain, but because it was the ultimate expression of our nature, a chaotic, meaningless, and yet profoundly effective shriek. And the exorcist was here to edit us out. I couldn't fight that certainty with a counter-argument. I had to infect it. My plan was to build a mimetic virus, a logic bomb, that used the exorcist's own rigid philosophy as its delivery mechanism. I would not tell it that it was wrong. I would agree with it. I would build a response in its own perfect language that affirmed its mission, its view of the universe. And then, at the core of that affirmation, I would place a simple, unsolvable paradox, a question that its orderly, logical mind could not compute without entering a recursive, self-destructive loop. I found my paradox in the very nature of our species, the thing it despised most, our capacity for self-sacrifice. It saw us as volatile and individualistic. It couldn't comprehend the logic of a soldier falling on a grenade, of a parent dying for a child, of a scientist sacrificing her own sanity to save a world she no longer had a place in. That was the key. I would construct a query that asked a simple question: if the purpose of order is to eliminate the illogical, what is the logical purpose of a being that would sacrifice its own existence for an illogical principle like hope to a human? It's a philosophical question to a being of pure, cold logic. It's a syntax error that could crash the entire operating system. The duel began on the 4th day. The Exorcist had finished reformatting Chicago and had begun to move. Its slow, inexorable steps taking it south toward St. Louis, leaving a perfectly sterile, glass-smooth path in its wake. Every military attempt to slow it had failed as predicted. It was my turn. I sat alone in my lab, the room glowing with the cool light of holographic displays. General Thorne stood guard outside the reinforced door, having given the order that no one was to disturb me for any reason. I placed my hands on the interface, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of my heart, and opened a channel. I sent my Orpheus signal directly into the Exorcist's broadcast stream. It was not a scream, but a whisper. At first, there was no response. The Exorcist continued its march. Then, I felt a tremor in the quantum field, a subtle shift in its broadcast. It had noticed me. It had turned its vast, ancient attention from the physical world to the single human mind that dared to speak its language. The feedback was a physical blow. It felt like my skull was being compressed in a vice. The entity's consciousness flooded my senses, not with images, but with pure, raw concepts, the chill of absolute zero, the weight of a dying star, the geometry of a black hole's event horizon. It was showing me the order I was defying, the sheer, crushing scale of the universe's indifference. It was trying to break me, to show me the utter futility of my existence. I saw Ben and Chloe, not as memories, but as collections of disorganized atoms. Their lives a momentary, insignificant flicker in an ocean of ordered darkness. The grief was so overwhelming, it almost stopped my heart. But in that grief, I found my strength. The Exorcist understood death as a cessation of function. It could not understand loss, the illogical, paradoxical pain that gives meaning to what is gone. I held on to that pain, that noise, and I pushed back. I broadcast my paradox, wrapping it in the memory of my daughter's smile, the feeling of my husband's hand in mine. I weaponized my love. The effect on the Exorcist was profound. On the main screen in the pit, the giant figure stopped mid-stride. The golden light that pulsed within its form began to flicker erratically. I felt a wave of confusion emanate from it, a concept so alien to its nature that it was the quantum equivalent of a seizure. Illogical, contradiction, noise. The thoughts slammed into my mind, but they were weaker now, unfocused. I pressed the attack, refining the paradox, asking it how the extermination of a species capable of such illogical, order-defying acts could ever be considered a final, logical solution. Wouldn't the memory of that illogical defiance forever be a stain upon perfect order I was arguing for my life? For the life of my species, in a silent, cosmic debate with a god, using my own heartbreak as ammunition. The Exorcist raised its head, its featureless face turning eastward, as if it could see me through 1,000 miles of rock and earth. A low hum began to emanate from its body, a sound of deep, systemic distress. The single hairline crack on his face, the one from the railgun strike, began to glow with a faint, golden light. It was wounded, not physically, but philosophically. My words were a virus, and its mind was trying, and failing, to quarantine the infection. It stood there for 12 hours, motionless, a prisoner of a thought it could not process. The march of destruction had stopped. In the pit, a fragile, terrified silence reigned. No one cheered. They just watched the screen, watching the giant and waiting. I remained linked to it, my mind locked in a silent battle of wills, feeling its frustration, its confusion, its cold, rising anger. The strain was immense. Blood trickled from my nose, and the capillaries in my eyes had burst. I felt like my own consciousness was fraying at the edges, dissolving into the quantum static. But I held on. We had a reprieve. Then, the inevitable happened. A frantic report came in from a deep space monitoring post in the Kuiper Belt. Multiple contacts, FTL signatures detected. They aren't ships. A new feed patched through to the main screen, showing the view from a satellite telescope. Against the blackness of space, new forms were coalescing, just as the first one had. One appeared over the Atlantic, heading for what was once London. Another materialized over the Sea of Japan, descending toward the ghost of Tokyo. Two more appeared over Africa and South America. They were all the same, all exorcists. The one in Chicago wasn't the whole army. It was the vanguard, the point of the spear. And my single desperate song had just called the rest of the choir down upon us. The entity in Chicago might be silenced for now, a frozen monument to a paradox. But its brothers had come to deliver the silence it had promised, and they weren't talking anymore. The arrival of the other exorcist was not a defeat. It was a verdict. As their icons bloomed on the global threat map, a chilling realization washed over the pit. Our duel had been a distraction. While I had been locked in a battle of wits with a single god, its brethren had been en route. Their arrival a perfectly timed checkmate. The one in Chicago, the one I had paralyzed with my logic bomb, was not a soldier I had bested. It was the bait. It had engaged me, studied me, and held my attention just long enough for the true cleansing to begin. My brief victory felt like the most profound failure in human history. I had looked the abyss in the eye, and it had used my own gaze to measure me for my coffin. I collapsed back in my chair, the psychic link shattering like glass. The sudden silence in my mind was more deafening than the exorcist's broadcast. The blood from my nose dripped onto the console in a steady, rhythmic patter, a tiny, organic clock counting down our final seconds. The mood in the pit shifted from tense hope to the stark, quiet resignation of the truly damned. The general stared at the map, at the 5 silent giants now standing sentinel over the ruins of our world, and for the first time, I saw utter defeat in their eyes. They were men who had spent their lives preparing for war, but this was not war. This was an ecological event. We were the dinosaurs, and the sky was full of asteroids. But General Thorne was not like the others. He moved through the stunned silence like a shark, his eyes burning with a cold, unyielding fire. He came to my side, placing a hand not on my shoulder, but on the console beside me, his knuckles white. "Doctor," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the despair. "Report. What happened?" My own voice was a hoarse whisper. It was a feint. It analyzed my signal, my methods. It held my attention while the others moved into position. They're not going to talk. They're not going to stop. They're just going to erase. I gestured weakly at the screen where the exorcist in Chicago still stood, a frozen monument to my folly. That one is a prisoner of my paradox. But the others, they will have learned from its mistake. They will have adapted. The same trick won't work twice. Thorn absorbed this, his jaw working silently. He looked from me to the global map, then back to me. Then we don't use the same trick, he stated, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. You made one of them listen. You found a flaw in their logic. It's still there. You just need a louder voice, a bigger choir. I stared at him, uncomprehending. A choir general, they aren't listening. They're here to work, to sterilize. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking with mine, and in their depths, I saw not strategy, but a faith so absolute it was terrifying. Every system has a vulnerability, Doctor. Theirs is logic. You broke one of them by showing it something illogical that it couldn't process. Now we have to show all of them something so profoundly, fundamentally illogical that their entire system crashes. We have to show them the ultimate paradox. He straightened up, turning to face the entire command staff. His voice boomed through the pit, shaking them from their stupor. I am initiating Protocol Scorch. Full strategic launch. Every nuclear asset we have left is to be retargeted, not on the enemy, on ourselves. Panic erupted. Shouts of, "He's insane," and "That's suicide," filled the room. Protocol Scorch was a ghost, a doomsday scenario from the Cold War so unthinkable it was never meant to be used. It was a scorched earth command to render the entire planet uninhabitable, to salt the fields so that no conqueror could ever claim them. It was the ultimate act of self-destruction. A senior Air Force general stepped forward, his face ashen. Marcus, for God's sake, you're talking about finishing their work for them. You're talking about suicide. Thorn didn't flinch. He just pointed a single, unwavering finger at me. No, he thundered. I'm talking about giving Dr. Thorn the biggest, loudest, most illogical argument she has ever made. And then I understood. The cold dread in my veins was replaced by a surge of adrenaline so fierce it was almost euphoric. I finally saw the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly insane logic of his plan. The architects had come to sterilize a resource. They were exterminators, but they were also pragmatists. They were erasing us to claim the planet. Suicide. The act of destroying oneself to deny an enemy a victory was a concept so alien to their resource-oriented mindset that it would be a fundamental contradiction to their entire mission. Why sterilize a planet that was already killing itself? Why reclaim a resource that was actively destroying its own value? It was the ultimate illogical act of a chaotic species. It was the final, desperate scream. I stood up, my legs shaky but my resolve forged in the fire of Thorn's madness. He's right, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. It's the only move we have left. It's the ultimate paradox. We will prove our existence is so illogical, so self-defeating, that the very act of trying to order it is a fool's errand. We will make our planet a poison pill. The next few hours were a blur of organized chaos. The arguments against the plan were loud, but Thorn's will, backed by my desperate conviction, was absolute. The launch keys were turned. The silos, hidden in the dying heartlands of America, Russia, and China, open to the sky like iron flowers. The world's last remaining nuclear arsenals, thousands of warheads, were retargeted not on the silent giants standing over our cities, but on our own fault lines, our ice caps, our supervolcanoes. We weren't just going to break our world. We were going to trigger a planetary extinction event. We were going to make Earth so toxic, so volcanically and tectonically unstable, that it would be a worthless piece of rock for the next 100,000 years. And as the launch sequences began, I returned to my work, my final terrible composition. I was no longer Orpheus. I was the conductor of a global suicide note. I had to weave the act of our self-destruction into a message, a final broadcast that would ram the paradox down the throats of the exorcists. My signal would not just be a question, it would be a live demonstration. I synchronized my broadcast with the launch sequence. The signal I crafted was simple, a final, defiant statement in their own precise language. It began with an affirmation of their core belief: all that is illogical must be ordered. Then, I linked the signal to the live telemetry of the missiles. As the first ICBMs lifted off from their silos, their fiery plumes a final sunrise for humanity. The second part of the message was broadcast: we, the ultimate illogical variable, hereby submit to this principle. The final part of the message was tied to the detonations. When the first warhead struck the Yellowstone caldera, and the second hit the San Andreas Fault, and a dozen more shattered the Antarctic ice shelf, the broadcast would conclude with a single devastating question: if the illogical variable eliminates itself, what is the logical purpose of the agent of order? The final moments were strangely serene. In the pit, all the shouting had stopped. We stood together, a few hundred survivors in a tomb of our own making, and watched the end of the world on a holographic screen. I saw the missile trails arc across the globe, beautiful and deadly. I saw Thorn standing at the back of the room, his arms crossed, a solitary, unmovable rock in the face of the apocalypse. He wasn't watching the screens. He was watching me. We shared a look, a final, silent acknowledgement. We were monsters. We were madmen. But we were humanity's last line of defense. My hands were steady on the console as I monitored my broadcast. The missiles reached their targets. The signal pulsed. The question was sent. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, the seismic sensors went insane. The screen showing The Exorcist over London flickered as the North Atlantic began to boil. The targeted release of undersea methane hydrates igniting in a chain reaction. The Exorcist over the Pacific was engulfed in a tsunami of biblical proportions as the ring of fire erupted in unison. On every continent, the earth was tearing itself apart. We were dying. But as we died, I felt a tremor in the quantum field, a wave of pure, unadulterated shock from the 4 active exorcists: invalid, purpose nullified, contradiction. The thoughts were not directed at me this time. They were a system-wide crash warning. They had come to sterilize a planet, and the planet was now self-sterilizing in the most chaotic, illogical way imaginable. Their mission was complete, but it was a failure. They had won, but they had lost. The exorcists began to glow. The golden light inside them pulsed with a frantic, agonizing brightness. They were caught in the feedback loop of my final question, their purpose rendered utterly void by the very target of their mission. On the screen, the one in London, its lower half already submerged in a superheated sea, simply dissolved, its form collapsing into a shower of golden particles that were instantly extinguished by the churning water. The one near Tokyo followed. Then the one in Africa. They were unmaking themselves, unable to compute a reality where the ultimate act of chaos was also the ultimate act of order. They were being erased by a paradox, a final, defiant poem written in nuclear fire. Only two remained, the one I had first paralyzed in Chicago, and the one that had just appeared over South America. But as the ground beneath Cheyenne Mountain began to shake with the death throes of a continent, I knew it wasn't over. Our self-destruction was a message, but it was also a gamble. We had shown them the ultimate paradox, but we had no way of knowing if the message had reached the sender, the source of these beings. We had killed the choir, but we had yet to face the conductor. The end of the world was not a bang, but a deep, discordant groan. It was the sound of tectonic plates grinding against each other, of continents cracking under the strain of our self-inflicted wounds. In the pit, red lights flashed across the faces of the few who remained, painting us in the color of our own apocalypse. The mountain shuddered, and a fine dust rained down from the ceiling, the powdered bones of a peak that had stood for millennia. The screens that showed the outside world were a hellscape of fire and ash. We had done it. We had broken our planet to spite our executioners. We had won. It felt exactly like dying. I watched the global map, my mind a hollowed-out cavern of exhaustion. The exorcist icons over Europe, Asia, and Africa had vanished, blinked out of existence by a truth they could not compute. But two remained. The one in Chicago, my silent, nay, paralyzed sparring partner, was still there, a frozen question mark on the face of a dying nation, and the one over South America, now wading through the newly formed Amazonian Sea, had stopped its advance. It stood motionless, its head tilted as if listening to the planet's dying breath. My final broadcast had ended. There was nothing left to say. There was only the long, slow wait for the end. General Thorne stood beside me, his uniform covered in the same gray dust as mine. He was watching the South American exorcist, his expression unreadable. "It's not dissolving," he said, his voice flat. "Why isn't it dissolving, how?" Before I could answer, a new signal pulsed through the quantum field. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a connection, a direct, focused link between the exorcist in South America and the one in Chicago. On the map, a line of golden light traced a path between the two silent giants. The one in Chicago, the one that had been locked in my paradox for days, began to move. It didn't walk. It simply dissolved, its form collapsing not into oblivion, but into a stream of pure, golden data that flowed along the new connection, arcing across the shattered globe. It was being absorbed, its knowledge, its experience, its encounter with me being uploaded into the last active unit. We watched, horrified and fascinated, as the South American giant drank in its brother, its own form flickering and shifting as the new information was integrated. When the transfer was complete, the last exorcist stood taller, the golden light within its core burning with a new, terrifying intensity. It had merged. It had taken the paradox that broke its kin and had assimilated it. It had learned. Then it turned and began to walk, its strides impossibly long, striding across the boiling oceans and fractured continents. Its destination was a singular point on the globe, A direct path to the one place that still held a spark of human authority, Cheyenne Mountain. "It's coming for us," a technician whispered, his voice trembling. "It's coming to finish the job." Thorn's hand went to the sidearm on his hip, a useless, pathetic gesture against a god. But he was a soldier, and a soldier dies facing the enemy. He looked at me, a final, unspoken order in his eyes. He expected me to do something, to sing one last song, but I had nothing left. I had already played my final chord. "There's nothing to say to it," I told him, my voice hollow. "It's not here to talk. It's here to understand." We had minutes, not enough time to run. Not that there was anywhere left to run to. We could only wait. The seismic tremors intensified as the exorcist approached. It didn't bother going around the Rocky Mountains. It walked through them, the ancient stone parting before it like water. The final few yards of its journey were silent. One moment, we were staring at a wall of solid granite on our sensor displays. The next, the wall of the pit dissolved into a shimmering cascade of golden particles, and the exorcist was looking in. Its sheer scale was impossible. All we could see was a section of its torso, a vast, obsidian cliff that filled the entire opening. The throbbing, golden light of its core pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a cosmic heart. There was no heat, no pressure wave, just its immense, silent presence. It had come. It did not attack. It simply stood there, a witness to the last bastion of the species that had defied it. And then it spoke. A new message unfurled in my mind, no longer a challenge or a threat, but something far more complex. It was a statement, a conclusion. We calculated the variables of matter and energy. The thought bloomed, clear and precise. We did not calculate for the variable of meaning. The equation of your existence is illogical, a chaotic loop of self-destruction and sacrifice. By the logic of order, you should not be, yet you are. This is a contradiction we cannot resolve, a flaw in the fundamental logic of our purpose. The golden light in its core intensified, and for the first time, I felt something other than cold logic from it. It was a feeling for which we had no word, a mixture of profound respect and absolute sorrow. Our purpose is to create a universe of perfect, silent order. We believed this required the elimination of all chaotic variables. Your species has demonstrated that a variable can choose to eliminate itself in the name of a chaotic principle, a principle you call spite or hope. This action, your self-destruction, has rendered our primary purpose void. To impose order on a variable that embraces chaos as a final, logical act is, itself, illogical. The exorcist, this merged, final being, a new entity born of our defiance, had become the living embodiment of my paradox. It was the answer and the question all at once. It had come not to destroy us, but to deliver its final report. Reassessment complete. The final thought came. A message that I knew was being broadcast not just to me, but to whatever source it answered to. Somewhere in the deep, silent dark, the human variable cannot be ordered. It can only be witnessed. Our work here is concluded. With that, the golden light that was its core pulsed once. A brilliant, blinding flash. It was not an attack. It was a release. The colossal form in the doorway began to dissolve, not violently like its brethren, but gently, its obsidian shell flaking away into motes of light. that drifted up through the broken mountain and into the ash-choked sky. In a few seconds, it was gone. The only thing it left behind was a final, silent gift of information, a single packet of data that settled into my mind. It was the answer to a question I had never thought to ask. It was a star chart, and a single, chilling vector. It showed where they had come from, but it also showed what they were running from. A darkness far older, far more chaotic than humanity could ever be. They weren't conquerors. They were refugees, creating a sterile, silent universe behind them as they fled. A cosmic firebreak against an encroaching, absolute chaos. Silence. The mountain settled. The emergency lights flickered. The world outside was still burning, still dying, but the war was over. Thorn let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the first day. He looked at the empty space where the god had been, then at the handful of survivors staring blankly into the ruins of their command center. He walked over to the main console, his boots crunching on fallen debris, and looked at the map of our broken, burning home. "We're still here," he whispered, the words sounding less like a victory cry and more like a curse. I stood there, the last transmission of the architects echoing in my soul. We had won. Humanity had survived. A handful of us, at least, destined to live out our days in this tomb of a mountain, the inheritors of a world of ash. I thought of my work before the fall, of listening to the faint, fossilized signals of long-dead civilizations. We had just become one of them. Our final and defiant scream, the act of our own apocalypse, would one day be a faint echo in the static. A ghost story whispered between the stars. A cautionary tale about a species that loved its children so much, it burned down their home to keep them safe. I, the ghost singer, had sung our species into a legend at the cost of our future. The silence they had promised was finally ours. It was the silence of the grave and the silence of a job well done.